Ever wonder what bosses I personally like a lot in Bleed 2 and which bosses I am not really too hot on? And maybe what bosses are just like a little bit bad? Well, in this top 28 list over all the bosses in the entire game, we're going to go through every single boss in this game from the bottom to the top. In this first part, we are going to focus on the bottom bosses on this list, but don't let that fool you. Most of the bosses on this list are actually pretty enjoyable to fight. Most of the time it's just because there is a lot of dead room in the fight, or because the fights are simply way too short or too easy that is putting them this low on the list. So please stay tuned as we go through the bottom 9 spots for the best bosses in Bleed 2. On the 28th spot of this list, we find one of the only 2 bosses I actually find genuinely not fun in this entire game, and that is the Shield Invader. I know a lot of people are gonna say stuff like, well, these 2 bosses you're gonna put here are actually not bosses, they are like oversized mobs, but they have the boss health bar and you have defeat to progress. They are basically being treated as bosses, so for this list we are gonna treat them as bosses. This first boss, the goal of this fight is just reflect a bullet back at them. It's basically a mechanic in the game that is very important, so they want to highlight in this boss by forcing you to use it. In the end though, if you have any sort of New Game Plus weapons, it's just you do one shot and the boss is down. And even then, it's very easy just to one reflect. It's very quick fight, very easy, far too easy, far too boring. This is something that should have been its own tutorial rather than being an actual boss fight in the game. On spot number 27, we find the Rolling Invader. The Rolling Invader suffers a similar fate to the Shield Invader in that it is basically a tutorial boss. But what makes this boss go up on the list isn't that I think that slow motion is a better mechanic. I hate slow motion, I hate that mechanic and never ever use it, including on this boss fight. Except for to do a cutscene skip, but that's an entirely different topic altogether. That would more like fall into speedrun strats rather than a top list. So, what makes this boss more fun than the other one? Well, there is actually kind of unintended, semi-unintended maybe, strat that you are not using slow motion here. You are instead shooting the boss while he flies up between the rolls to basically deliver some very fast damage on them. It's a very quick way to kill this fight, and it's very satisfying to do so compared to just reflecting a bullet and be over with it. Which means that I have to put this boss a little bit above. This boss is still very clearly on bottom though compared to everything else that's coming up after this, so treat these 2 as like the super bottom tier of the list. As said before, these fights should have been tutorials, not actual boss fights. On spot number 26 we start to get to the spicy stuff, and here we find Valentine Cars. The reason why this fight is so ridiculously low on this list is because it's a fight you are not really at any peril to die on. It's basically just a waiting game for you to get Valentine to do her mechanics. And if you fail them, you have to play the waiting game again to see her do the mechanic again. It's a very forgiving fight if you are not speedrunning. And even if you're not speedrunning though, the punishment is mostly just more annoyance. Because it's very boring to just stand and wait for the boss to do something. And this is definitely gonna be the case a lot of the time in this fight. You're gonna spend a lot of time standing around, especially if you are playing this first time and fail some mechanics. This means that this fight is probably one of the less fun actual fights in the game. It doesn't go to say that the mechanics are bad, the mechanics are pretty fun to execute, but the punishment for failing shouldn't be so rough. It really decreases the enjoyment of this fight. Spot number 25 on this list is a highly personal choice for me. It's highly personal, and that is Ninja. Ninja is a 2-stage fight. The first stage is actually pretty enjoyable. You are basically trying to meet him up in the air with their katana swing, and you do a katana swing and basically reflect them. It's a very entertaining way to display the katana things. It really is a better display of the Reflect than the actual first tutorial. This is pretty much how they should have done it. This is more fun, this is more engaging, and it's definitely very much more explaining of the situation. The problem here arrives on phase 2 of the fight. Phase 2 of the fight is going to either compose of you standing and waiting a lot, like you did during the Valentine fight, and I mean a lot. You are gonna have to wait a lot in this fight if you're not doing certain tricks. Or you do cheesy strats. And the cheesy strat in this fight is very boring, and it adds some RNG elements to the fight as well, whether or not to take damage, which is kinda not cool at all. It means that this fight leaves a little bit of a sour taste in my mouth when I play it, on, especially on New Game. In Freestyle you can do some laser strats to mitigate some of the annoyance, but it's still gonna be a lot of like back and forth, that's a little boring. But it's not a horrible fight, but it's basically a personal touch. This is my personal low entry on the list. I can definitely see people liking this fight, but it's just not for me. It's just not really cutting it. On spot number 24, we find Valentine D. This is the final section of a 4-part boss fight with Valentine, and this fight is suffering the same fate as the car fight a little bit, but there is some fun stuff going on here that makes this fight a little bit better. The problem with this fight is that it's either gonna be long or tricky or short. I would really have preferred if the fight was a little longer when you did the good strats for it, which is, for everyone who doesn't know, you can basically stun lock her in her animation to exceed this footage, so you can like basically keep her always floating around and getting hit, instead of having her like repeat her cycle. If you fail that, you're gonna have to repeat her cycle, which is actually kind of fun, but the problem is that this is in part not really intended. Okay, it probably is intended, because this game is very well made with like speed trap in mind. But it's like, it's not how people are gonna play this fight the first times around, so I have to judge it from that perspective, and from that perspective it isn't much more fun than the car fight. And even then, when you do the good strats, the fight's way too short and way too easy to be any kind of entertaining. So I have to put this fight a little low on this list. It hurts me, but basically from this point on, every single fight is gonna have something very good to it. On spot number 23 of this list, we get Rubble Bunny. And I am gonna keep on repeating myself a bit here. This fight has a lot of dead room when you can't really hit her and you basically don't have to dodge stuff, which is very boring, and there are like some segments where you can hit her and deal a lot of damage. However, this fight also has some key strats, but we're not gonna go into them here because these key strats are unintended. I'm not gonna hold them too much against the boss itself. The problem with this fight is, as I said before, there's a lot of dead room. It's probably intended you should slow down time and like hurt her while she's flying back and forth, but that's never what people are gonna do here, because it's far slower than just waiting for her to get out of her cycle when you can't hurt her, and going into their moods where you can hurt her a lot. The problem here is that even then, she only has two things, and one of them deals a lot of damage and the other deals quite a bit less damage. So you are basically stuck with only two patterns. Both are very easy to handle, and none of them are really exciting, and there's a lot of dead room in between those spots, so there's like not really much fun going on here, but it's really nothing horrible either. There's always a little bit to do, there's always dodge to do or deep damage to do, but generally speaking I am not too fond of this fight because it's just so much dead room where you can't shoot at the boss. And there is so much, like, yeah, it's too little. When the fight is engaged, it's just too little. It's sad because this is generally speaking a quite fun fight, but I really wish there was more of the fun parts to it. On spot number 22, we find the Semi-Core. The Semi-Core is basically Rival's car, which is a quite interesting fight. It is a very unique fight. On this fight, you are literally standing on the boss and like try to shoot the car until it gets defeated. And the boss does some mechanics try to throw you off. There are 3 mechanics in this fight, 1 laser beam, 1 part where the boss goes up, and 1 part where you choose laser. And there are constantly going rockets across the screen while all of these happen. This all sounds very fun. This is a pretty fun fight. I am not gonna lie, this, as I said before, every single fight that is not like at the very bottom of this list are actually genuinely good fights. So what keeps this fight down on the list? There isn't really too much speaking of it. It's a very generic fight. It's very easy to aim and hit the boss. It's basically just a long period of dodging rockets, and there are some very easy ways to constantly and consistently avoid every single mechanic if you want to. It's definitely slower that way, but it makes the fight a little bit steep. Despite that though, I can't really say too much bad about this fight, except that the mechanics are definitely not weighted it evenly. The only mechanic that is actually sort of rough to dodge is the laser, which basically translates to that a lot of the fight is gonna be very simple, and sometimes you can basically have a fight without anything rough happening ever. At which point this fight just becomes a gun and done deal. On spot number 21 of this list we find Roboguppy, and we spoke about Gun and Gun before, and this boss is the literal definition of that term. So why is this boss so high on this list despite me implying that the boss is far too easy? Well, I'm not gonna hold bosses being too easy about too much, but at the same time, as I said before, it's gonna really affect me. But here's the thing, this boss is actually quite entertaining despite being very easy. And it's definitely not a short fight on the higher difficulty levels, which is where you are basically asking for a challenge. And this boss has 2 mechanics to it, which are both very interesting and work with one another in a very interesting way. And the first one is that the boss can shoot a lot of enemies out of it at a constant pace to basically add more and more stuff on the screen for you to dodge over time, unless you decide to destroy the enemy. Or the boss is gonna descend upon you and start to do a dash at you. And when it does the dash, if it's yellow, dodge, and if it's purple, give the boss a little smooch and send him back. It's a very interesting combo of mechanics that works so well. But there's also another attack in addition to all of this, that the boss stands up in the air and sends a signal to every single enemy to like self-destruct and attack you at once, which causes a very intense bullet barrage that you are either gonna have to reflect or dodge, which is a very interesting and fun mechanic to handle mid-fight. And makes it so that the longer between those sections happening, the more intense that part is gonna be. It's very much a fun fight. The only issue with this fight is that it is a bit too easy, but it's not gonna hold back too much here because the fight is still interesting despite being easy. So I feel very confident putting this one on the number 21 spot of the list. On spot number 20 we find the Manticore. The Manticore is a very interesting and fun boss fight in that it's basically composed of like 2 parts. One part when it's gonna shoot bullets at you at a constant rate and you have to either dodge or reflect, or at the higher difficulty levels, most likely a combination of both, really. This makes this part of the fight very entertaining, and then there's the second part of the fight where the boss throws in some mechanics. A lot of bosses have a similar cycle to this, but in this boss it's very much more highlighted because the first part is actually interesting and not just you doing free damage. The second part is when the boss does its core mechanics. And it has 3 of those, and I am not gonna lie, neither of those feels very to the top of the road here. This boss is very much defined in how fun it is by the first part of the fight, which is very different from most other bosses, which have like the mechanics being the fun part. It's basically the boss itself being fun, but the mechanics are a little rough. The first mechanic is basically the boss gonna go back and forth with its claws across the screen, and you are gonna have to like stay within a very short space and try to not get hit. And another one is that the boss can try to stab you, and the third is a squat. The squat can either be purple or yellow, and how you handle it depends if it's purple or yellow. If it's yellow, you obviously dodge. If it's purple, you go up and give the boss a little cute little smooch and send him back up and back down. It's a very fun fight, but it's held back by the fact that a couple of the mechanics are a little boring. They are definitely rough, they're definitely holding up to the difficulty level you are expecting towards the end of the game, but they are a little stale and they are getting boring after a while. It's very easy to save those strats if you want to, but you probably don't want to because it's just gonna pull out the fight way longer than it needs to. Generally speaking though, it's a very solid fight, but that could have a little bit more variation to its mechanics and make the mechanics feel a little more fun. So that wraps up part 1 of 3 of our 3-part series where we are gonna rank every single Bleed 2 boss according to our own very highly and sophisticated and intelligent, wonderful, cute, and most important of all, completely objective opinion. If you have any disagreements about these very, very objective opinions, please leave those in the comment section below. You might think I'm a little rough on some bosses, or think that some bosses should have even been lower on this list. And that's completely fine, share those opinions, and I'll respond to you and say what I thought about it. And as always, I would really appreciate if you press the like button and subscribe to me. And if you want more like this, I have a little list here when I am going through all the weapons ranked after usefulness, which might be a little enlightening to people who are looking out to learn more about this game. And in very soon time, we're gonna have a little video here about the rest of this list basically, where we're gonna go into part 2. So stay tuned for that, and until then, lots of hugs to everyone, and please stay cute and safe everyone, and see you then, bye bye!